I am 77 years old. My name is Daniel Park. I was sitting in the seventh row of the Long Beach Arena on a Saturday afternoon in October 1972 when Steven Seagal grabbed a microphone and told 8,000 people that Bruce Lee was a fraud. I was there when Bruce walked into the ring. I was there for all 3 times Seagal hit the floor, and I was there for what happened after, which is the part that still keeps me up some nights. I have never told this story to a reporter or a camera. I am telling it now because I am 77 years old and some things deserve to be said before the people who saw them are all gone.
The Southern California Martial Arts Invitational was not the biggest event of its kind in America, but it was close. 8,000 seats, most of them filled by early afternoon, the kind of crowd that showed up because they actually trained in something and wanted to see real skill from real practitioners across real disciplines. Not a casual audience, not tourists, fighters, coaches, students, people who had spent years in gyms and dojos and understood the difference between something performed and something genuine, the kind of crowd that is very hard to fool and very quick to recognize when something unusual is happening. The 1972 edition had been running since Friday morning, 2 full days of competition across 8 divisions, from junior practitioners to senior masters, covering karate, judo, aikido, kung fu, and several hybrid systems that didn't fit neatly into any single category. By Saturday afternoon, the competition portion was essentially complete, and the arena had shifted into the closing ceremony, the presentation of awards and trophies, the formal acknowledgement of the weekend's standout performers. I had been there since Friday. My nephew competed in the junior karate division, and I'd driven down from San Francisco specifically to watch him, which meant I'd been sitting in those bleachers for most of 2 days and had seen almost everything the weekend had produced. By Saturday afternoon, I was tired and satisfied in the way you get tired and satisfied after watching a lot of good martial arts. Ready for the ceremony to wrap up, ready for the drive home. The word had been moving through the arena since about noon that day. Someone in the program was a surprise. A guest who hadn't been listed on the official schedule. Someone who'd been asked at the last minute to present one of the major awards and had agreed. The whisper traveled through the crowd, the way whispers travel through a martial arts audience, which is fast and specific, name and detail both intact by the time it reached the 7th row. Bruce Lee was here, not as a competitor, not as a demonstrator, as a presenter. He'd been asked to hand the Senior Karate Grand Champion trophy, the largest trophy of the event, to whoever won the final match of the weekend. Simple, ceremonial, the kind of appearance that took 20 minutes and meant a great deal to the people who mattered. The response in that arena, when people understood he was actually there, not a rumor, actually present somewhere in the building, was the specific kind of excited murmur that 8,000 people create when they collectively understand that their afternoon just became more significant than they expected. I looked around when I heard the name confirmed and watched the faces near me shift, training partners turning to each other, coaches nodding, a few younger students in the bleachers visibly unable to stay fully seated. Bruce Lee was not yet the global phenomenon he would become after Enter the Dragon released the following year, but in a martial arts arena in Southern California in 1972, his name meant everything. He had trained some of the most recognizable names in the industry. He had built a system, Jeet Kune Do, that had fundamentally changed how serious practitioners thought about cross-disciplinary training. He had written, taught, demonstrated, and produced real students across a decade of dedicated work that had nothing to do with cameras. The film work was on top of all of that, not instead of it. Everybody in that arena understood the distinction, everybody except, as it would turn out, the young man accepting the trophy. Steven Seagal was 20 years old in October of 1972. He had been training in Aikido for 6 years, starting at 14, under a teacher in Orange County who ran a respected school and who Seagal had apparently impressed enough to promote aggressively through competition circuits. By the time he showed up at the Invitational, he had a regional reputation as a technically sound Aikido practitioner with unusual physical gifts, tall, strong, coordinated in a way that made his throws and joint controls look cleaner than most people his age could manage. He had won 2 smaller tournaments before this one and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had succeeded early enough to believe success was his natural state, rather than something he'd worked for. He won the senior division final match that Saturday afternoon with a clean performance. I watched it from the 7th row. He was good, genuinely good, for his age and his years of training. The throw that ended the final match was precise and well-timed, the kind of technique that earns real respect from a knowledgeable crowd, and the 8,000 people in those bleachers gave it to him. Real applause, earned applause. He stood at the center of the mat, accepting it, with the ease of a young man who expected this outcome and was pleased to have it confirmed. And that's when the MC walked to the center microphone and announced that the award for Senior Grand Champion would be presented by a special guest. Bruce Lee walked out from the side entrance of the arena floor. The noise those 8,000 people made when they saw him is something I've never been able to fully describe to anyone who wasn't there. It wasn't the polite, welcoming applause of an audience acknowledging a celebrity appearance. It was genuine. It was the sound of 8,000 practitioners recognizing someone they considered the most important martial artist of their generation, walking onto a floor they had all been sitting around for 2 days. People stood. The whole arena, or close enough to the whole arena that the seated people were invisible, stood up. Bruce walked to the center of the mat carrying the trophy, and the look on his face was the look it always was in moments like that. Not performing modesty, not enjoying the attention, just moving through a room with the same even quality he brought to everything. Unhurried, present, the specific kind of calm that comes from having nothing to prove. He reached the center and stood facing Seagal and extended the trophy. Seagal took it with his right hand. He did not bow. In that arena, on that floor, at the conclusion of that event, in front of 8,000 people who had spent 2 days watching competitors show respect to each other through the formal bow that every discipline in that building shared as a baseline gesture, Seagal took the trophy from Bruce Lee and did not bow. The crowd noticed, not loudly, not immediately, but the kind of collective noticing that registers as a shift in atmosphere rather than a sound, a subtle wrongness, something that didn't fit what everyone there understood about how this moment was supposed to go. Bruce held the bow for a moment, extended it, the way you extend something when you're giving the other person time to respond appropriately. Then he straightened. His expression did not change. He nodded once, the minimum acknowledgement, and turned to step back toward the side entrance. That should have been the end of it. A small awkwardness, a moment of bad manners from a young man who maybe didn't think before he acted, absorbed by a crowd that had plenty of other things to focus on. The ceremony would have continued. The weekend would have concluded. The drive home would have been unremarkable. Then Seagal turned to the microphone. He thanked the tournament organizers. He thanked his coach. He thanked the audience for 2 great days of competition. He said all the expected things in the expected order, and the crowd applauded in the expected ways, and it seemed like the moment had passed. And then he kept talking. He said he wanted to address something that had been on his mind since the announcement about the special presenter was made that morning. He said he meant no disrespect to anyone involved in organizing the event. He said he understood that bringing in a well-known name was good for publicity, good for drawing attention to the martial arts community. Then he said it. He said that real martial arts and Hollywood martial arts were 2 different things, and that when the line between them was blurred, it created a false impression for the public about what the arts actually were and who the actual masters of them were. He said a man who used martial arts as a vehicle for film stardom was not the same as a man who dedicated his life to a discipline for the discipline's own sake. He said the person who should be presenting trophies at a serious martial arts competition was someone who had competed at the highest level, who had tested himself against real opponents under real conditions, not someone who had learned to make punches look good on camera. The arena went from quiet to completely silent as it became obvious where he was going. He looked at the side entrance where Bruce had already started to move and said, loud enough for the microphone to catch every word and send them through the entire building. I have a question. If this is a martial arts competition, and the winner of this competition deserves recognition from someone who actually understands martial arts, then why is a Hollywood actor presenting my trophy? 8,000 people absorbed that. The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then the murmuring started, the specific sound of a large crowd processing something it wasn't prepared for, uncertain whether what it had just heard was as serious as it sounded or would turn out to be some kind of misunderstanding. Bruce had stopped walking. He was about 12 feet from the side entrance, halfway off the mat, and he had stopped. His back was still to the microphone, still to Seagal, still to the 8,000 people now watching him instead of the young man with the trophy. If you think the Nobo was bad, you have no idea what Seagal said into that microphone next. He said, I train 6 days a week. I have been training since I was 14. I have tested what I know against real opponents who were actually trying to beat me. I have the trophy to prove it. What does he have? A movie poster? Some students who paid to learn from a man who is famous because a camera liked his face? The arena made a sound. Not a unified sound, something more fractured, different sections reacting differently. Some people clearly angry at what they were hearing, some people not sure what to make of it. A few people near me who seemed like they might actually agree with parts of it, even while being uncomfortable with the delivery. Bruce turned around. He turned slowly, and he walked back to the center of the mat, and the crowd, the parts of it that had been making noise, went quiet as he walked. The quality of his movement in that moment is something I've thought about many times since. There was nothing aggressive in it, nothing that looked like anger, nothing that would have alarmed anyone watching purely on physical terms. He walked back the same way he walked everywhere, even and unhurried, with that quality of complete presence. But something in the room understood that the situation had fundamentally changed, and the room responded to that understanding before anyone had said anything that confirmed it. He stopped a few feet from Seagal and looked at him. He said, "Before the first film, I had been teaching for 9 years. I had students who went on to become champions in multiple disciplines. I developed a system of combat that drew from direct real contact training across multiple schools and spent years refining it against real practitioners. The films came after all of that, not instead of it." Seagal said, "Can you prove it?" And those 3 words changed the afternoon in a way that the previous 2 minutes of insults hadn't, because they were a real challenge rather than a rhetorical one, and they had been delivered in front of 8,000 people who were now all paying the most complete attention I have seen a large arena crowd pay to anything. Bruce said, "What does proof look like to you?" Seagal said, "Get on the mat with me. 1 round. Let's see what Hollywood Kung Fu does against someone who actually trains." The arena made the kind of noise a crowd makes when it has just realized it is watching the introduction to something much larger than it prepared for, when it bought its ticket that morning. People who had been inching toward the exits for the last 20 minutes reversed direction. People who had been standing at the concession area came back. The energy in that building shifted so completely and so fast that I could feel it in my chest, a kind of pressure change, the specific atmosphere of 8,000 people simultaneously deciding that they were not going anywhere. The tournament organizers were in motion. I could see them from the 7th row, men in blazers moving toward the center of the mat from 2 different directions, already talking into each other's ears, already trying to figure out how to shut this down before it became something they'd be explaining to people for the next year. Bruce looked at the approaching organizers. He looked at Seagal. He looked briefly at the 8,000 people watching him from every direction. He said, "All right, 1 word," said at normal volume, the way he said everything. The arena heard it anyway, because 8,000 people who are paying complete attention to a single point of sound can hear something spoken at normal volume across a very large building when nothing else is making noise. The organizers reached the center of the mat. The senior one, a man I recognized from previous year's events as someone who ran things seriously and didn't like surprises, put himself physically between the 2 men and started talking, his voice low and urgent, gesturing toward the side entrance and then toward Seagal, and making it very clear that whatever was about to happen was not going to happen here, not in front of this crowd, not under this organization's banner. Seagal said, loudly enough for the nearby crowd to hear. He agreed. The man agreed. "Are you going to take that away from him too?" The organizer turned to Bruce. Bruce looked at him and said quietly, "It's fine. Let us use the back room. No cameras. Off the record." He looked at Seagal. "If that's what he actually wants." Seagal said, "That works for me." It probably should not have worked for anyone in a position of responsibility, but the organizer was also a martial artist, had been one for 30 years, and I think some part of him understood that certain situations had already determined their own outcome, regardless of what the people managing them tried to do about it. He stepped back. 2 other men, coaches or officials I didn't recognize, fell in with the group as they moved off the main floor toward the corridor that connected the arena to the back staging area. I watched them go, and then I did something I had never done before at any event like this. I got up and followed. Not close. I wasn't reckless about it, but I knew the layout of that building from previous years, knew there was a service corridor that connected to the staging area through a secondary door, and I knew that if I moved fast, I could get to a position where I might be able to hear what was happening without being in the middle of it. I made it. The secondary door was ajar, propped open for equipment access, and I positioned myself just outside it and could see through the gap into the staging area, which was large enough for what was about to happen, floored with the kind of rubberized material common in back-of-house arena spaces, lit by industrial overhead lighting that made everything look slightly flatter and harder than it did under the arena lights. About 20 people had made it back there ahead of me or with me. Coaches, officials, a few people who'd clearly done the same thing I'd done and found their way through. Nobody was talking. Everyone understood that talking would be the wrong thing to do right now. Seagal had taken off his jacket and handed it to someone. He settled into his stance in the center of the space, the wide base of an Aikido practitioner, weight distributed, hands ready. He was 20 years old, 6 feet tall, and carrying the specific physical confidence of a young man who has not yet experienced a moment that seriously challenged his understanding of his own capabilities. Bruce stood across from him in his clothes, the same clothes he'd walked into the arena in. He had not changed anything, not his jacket, not his shoes. He looked, from my position in the doorway, like a man who had agreed to something out of obligation, rather than interest. One of the coaches who had followed them back had apparently been nominated, or had nominated himself, to serve as a signal to begin. He looked at both men. He said, "Go." Seagal moved immediately, the way young fighters move when they're fueled by adrenaline and the expectation of winning, with too much commitment and too little reading of what's in front of them. He went for a wrist grab, the foundational entry for the kind of Aikido control technique that had won him his matches that afternoon. Fast and direct. The technique of a man who had used this entry successfully enough times that his body went there automatically under pressure. Bruce was not where the grab was aimed. He had moved laterally, a small step, so small from my position that I almost missed it, and Seagal's hand closed on nothing. The momentum of the grab attempt carried Seagal slightly forward, his weight committed to a direction that had abruptly lost its target, and in the fraction of a second while Seagal was processing this and beginning to recover, Bruce's right hand connected with his chest. Open palm, short range. The contact lasted less than a second. Seagal sat down. Not thrown, not swept. He sat down. Because 6 feet tall, 200 pounds of committed forward momentum that suddenly finds its target removed, and a precise amount of redirecting force applied at exactly the right angle, has exactly one place to go, which is down. The 20 people in that staging area produced a sound, not applause, not a cheer, something more involuntary than either of those, the collective noise of 20 people watching something they knew was possible in theory, but had never seen executed at this speed and this economy. Seagal was up fast. He was young, and his body recovered quickly, and the floor had not hurt him. He was upright and back in his stance in maybe 3 seconds, and his face in those 3 seconds went through a sequence that I've replayed mentally many times. Surprise first, then a flash of something that might have been reassessment, then something harder, settling over the top of both of those. He came again. This time different, not the wrist grab entry, a more direct approach, using his height and weight advantage to try to close distance and get his arms around Bruce in something closer to a bear hug entry, the kind of technique that works against almost everyone shorter and lighter than you, because physics is physics. Bruce sidestepped, and the bear hug closed around air. As Seagal's arms came together on nothing, Bruce was already next to him, already past the effective range of anything Seagal could throw from that position, and his left hand at Seagal's shoulder and his right hand at his elbow produced a joint angle that Seagal's body could not hold against, and Seagal went down again, this time forward onto his hands, catching himself before his face met the rubberized floor. The 20 people in the room said nothing. The silence after the second time was different from the silence after the first, heavier, the silence of people who have just had their last doubts removed. Seagal pushed himself up again. This took slightly longer than the first time. Not because he was hurt, he wasn't seriously hurt, but because something was happening in his processing of the situation that was slowing the automatic responses down. He stood and looked at Bruce, and there was something in his expression now that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. He'd come into that room thinking he knew how this was going to go. The 20-year-old version of the story he'd told himself all his life about who he was and what he could do. He'd put the trophy down to challenge a man he'd dismissed in front of 8,000 people, with the complete certainty of someone who had never been made to doubt himself. He came forward a third time, this time almost tentative compared to the first two, which told you more about his state of mind than any expression could. He threw a strike, an actual strike, fist rather than grab, trying to use the reach advantage to create distance and reset. Bruce slipped it the way he slipped everything, without looking like he was avoiding it, just by being somewhere slightly different than where the strike assumed he would be, and the combination of the slip and the hand that came in behind it put Seagal on the floor for the third time, this time flat on his back, looking up at the industrial lighting of the staging area. He stayed there longer this time. Not because of injury, because some part of him understood that getting up for a fourth time, without having landed anything, without having made meaningful contact once in 3 attempts, was going to produce a fourth result identical to the previous 3, and that fourth result would be sitting on the floor again, and that the floor was giving him more information than the fight was. He lay there on his back for what felt like a long time, but was probably about 5 seconds. Bruce stood where he'd been after the third exchange, hands at his sides, and then he did something that nobody in that room had expected. He turned and walked toward the corridor. He was leaving, not dramatically, not performing an exit, just walking, the same even pace he always had, moving toward the corridor door that I was standing outside of. Seagal said, from the floor, "We're not done." Bruce stopped. He turned around and he looked at Seagal, still lying on his back on the staging area floor, and he said something that every person in that room heard clearly because the room was completely silent. He said, "I know. but I am. Then he walked through the corridor and past me where I was standing in the doorway, and I pressed back against the wall, and he walked past, close enough that I could have touched him, and he was already looking somewhere else, already past whatever had just happened, moving through it, and beyond it, the way he moved through everything. Seagal got up. He got up slowly, and when he was standing, he looked around the room at the 20 people watching him, and his face was doing something complicated and private that he clearly did not want 20 people to be watching. He looked at the corridor where Bruce had just gone. Then he did something that genuinely surprised me. He followed. Not fast, not with the energy of the first challenge, but he walked into the corridor, and his voice came back into the staging area, sharp and carrying, saying something about this not being over, something about the arena still being full and them being able to go back out there, something about him not being done. I moved. I moved down the corridor to see where this was going, because I'd already come this far, and the situation clearly had more to it. Bruce had stopped about 30 feet down the corridor. He was standing still, and Seagal had reached him and was still talking, the voice of someone who has lost something significant and hasn't yet figured out how to absorb the loss, so is trying to undo it through words instead. Seagal was saying something about a rematch, about different rules, about Aikido being a defensive art designed specifically for this kind of situation, and that the staging area hadn't been the right context. Bruce listened to all of it. He stood there and let every word come out, the whole frustrated rush of it. And when Seagal finally stopped talking, Bruce said something. He said, "I heard what you said out there, about film and legitimacy, about Hollywood and real training. You were not completely wrong." Seagal stopped. Bruce said, "Film work creates a perception problem. I know that. The public sees me on a screen, and they think they know what I am, and most of what they think is not accurate. That's a real problem, and I haven't solved it." Seagal said. "Then why?" Bruce said, "Because the answer to that problem is not you calling me a fraud in front of 8,000 people after I handed you a trophy. The answer is in the work. The answer is in how honestly you train, and how honestly you represent what your training actually produces. I've been building something real for a long time. You had no information about that, and you decided not to get any before you spoke." Seagal was quiet. Bruce said, "You're 20 years old, and you're very good for 20 years old. You have real physical gifts, and you've been trained by someone serious, but what you showed out there in the ring today was nothing about your skill. It was all about your need to be recognized. Those are different things. One of them you can train. The other one will destroy what you train if you don't address it." Seagal said nothing. Something was working in his face that he was keeping mostly contained, but not entirely. Bruce said, "The question is not whether I'm legitimate. The question is whether you're actually interested in being what you say you are, a real martial artist, which means someone who keeps learning, keeps being wrong about things, keeps finding out that what they know is smaller than they thought. That's the real training. The rest of it is just performance." He said that last word with a very specific quality, not cruel, but precise, deliberate, using the word that Seagal had used about him out in the arena, giving it back to him as a mirror. Seagal stood in that corridor for a moment, and then he said something that I was not expecting to hear from the same person who had grabbed that microphone 20 minutes ago. He said, "Where do you train?" Bruce looked at him, a long, steady look. Then he said, "Culver City. Come on Tuesday. Don't be late." And he walked away down the corridor. Seagal stood in that corridor for another moment, looking at the space where Bruce had been. Then he went back toward the staging area, and I heard him talking to someone in there. The tone of his voice completely different from what it had been at the microphone, quieter and more uncertain, the voice of someone navigating something he hadn't prepared for. I went back to my seat, or I tried to. I made it as far as the tunnel entrance to the main arena floor, and then I stopped, because I could see from there that something else was happening in the building. Word had made it back into the arena from the people who'd witnessed the staging area, the way word always moves in a space where a lot of people are paying attention to the same thing. The crowd was different now than it had been before the ceremony, different in a way that was visible from the tunnel. People turned toward each other, talking, the specific animated quality of an audience that has received information it considers significant and is processing it in real time. The MC had stepped back to the main microphone and was trying to wrap up the ceremony, but the audience was not really listening, was giving maybe 40% of its attention to the official conclusion of the afternoon, and the rest to the conversations happening in every row of those bleachers. I found my seat and I sat there, and I watched the ceremony conclude around me, while thinking about what I'd just seen in a staging area 30 feet from the main corridor. Not the 3 takedowns, though those were their own extraordinary thing. What I kept returning to was the corridor conversation. The specific quality of Bruce choosing, in the immediate aftermath of being publicly humiliated and then physically challenged, to talk to Seagal as though the most important thing happening was Seagal's education rather than Bruce's vindication. He could have walked straight out of the building. He had walked past me in that corridor, and he could have kept going to the exit and gotten in his car and driven home and never said another word about any of it, and the story would have been complete in terms of what he'd demonstrated. 3 exchanges, 3 identical results, the same 7 seconds of clarity each time. He stopped instead, and he said the true thing to a 20-year-old who had just embarrassed himself in front of 8,000 people and was standing in a corridor trying to find a version of the afternoon that he could live with. Not the comfortable thing, the useful thing. I've thought about that choice more than almost anything else from that afternoon. The event wrapped about 40 minutes later. I drove back to San Francisco that evening with my nephew in the passenger seat, and for the first hour neither of us said much, which is unusual for us on a long drive. My nephew had heard some of what happened during the ceremony, enough to understand the broad shape of it, and he asked me a few questions that I answered as accurately as I could. At some point around Fresno, he asked me what I thought about Seagal. I told him what I'd seen in the corridor. The question about where Bruce trained, the way he'd said it, quiet, the bravado completely gone, just a young man asking a genuine question. My nephew thought about this for a moment, and then asked whether Seagal actually showed up on Tuesday. I told him I didn't know. I still don't. I never found out. If he did, nobody who was there ever mentioned it in anything I've come across, and I've looked more than once over the years. Maybe he went, maybe he didn't. Maybe he stood outside the school in Culver City for a few minutes, and then drove away. I genuinely don't know. What I know is what I saw. 8,000 people in the Long Beach Arena on a Saturday in October. A 20-year-old taking a microphone he should have set down and saying things he should have left unsaid. A man walking back onto a mat to answer those things, not with words but with something more final and more honest. And then the same man stopping in a corridor 30 feet from an exit to say the true thing to a young man who just earned the hard way that he needed to hear it. Bruce Lee died 9 months after that afternoon. I was at work when I heard the news, July of 1973, and I sat at my desk for a while without doing much of anything useful. I thought about the arena, about the 7 seconds, about the corridor, about the specific quality he had that I don't think I've ever seen in anyone else before or since, of being completely past whatever had just happened and already focused on whatever was actually worth focusing on. Not performing that quality, just having it, the way some people have perfect pitch or perfect timing, something that wasn't learned but came from years of building everything on top of something solid all the way down. I'm 77 years old now. I've been to a lot of events in those years and seen a lot of extraordinary things. Nothing has stayed with me quite like that afternoon. The sound the arena made when Bruce walked out, the sound it made after the first 7 seconds, the silence in the corridor. I was there, all of it. That's the whole story.